This is Demi Burchett's 2.3 assignment on fatigue and recovery. Today we are going to be discussing about fatigue and the impacts it has on different sports, and the strategies that we use in different intensities to try to delay it or even reduce fatigue. So first of all, we are going to be looking at fatigue and recovery in sports and how this differs in terms of exercise with different intensities and durations. And this is due to the different factors of the energy systems and waste products which are produced as a result. So first we need to identify what fatigue actually is. So fatigue is a feeling of exhaustion which impacts our ability to complete both physical and mental tasks. They can be both psychological and physiological, as fatigue can affect us both mentally and physically. An example of this could be an athlete who trains regularly, who could actually be overtraining themselves because their program is exceeding their recovery capacity. This therefore impacts their performance and involves the performer feeling unmotivated or not physically able to meet the demands. It occurs mainly in endurance athletes who continue to push themselves to run for prolonged periods of time. So for example, marathon runners, and athletes who are continuously taking part in maximum activities like sprinters or throwers, or even jumpers as well. Both athletes, from doing this, can result in cumulative effects of fatigue, which then prevents them from performing well in further events and in competitions, for example, when it is important, because it could result in their depletion in physical health, for example, if they sustain an injury which can potentially prevent them from performing for the long periods of time, and even their mental health, so they are unmotivated to do so. The effects of fatigue in sport is the athlete suffering with decreased concentration, which is one of the factors. This is a problem for sports like javelin or triple jump, because the athlete has to go through different transitions smoothly in order to execute the different phases correctly. So for example, in the long jump, they need to make sure that their run-up's appropriate, so they don't obviously go over the line, and so they can execute the phase in the air, so they can get the right position, so they can travel upwards and forwards instead of just moving horizontally. And the same with a throw. The javelin, they need to make sure that they have the right run-up and the step phase before they actually execute the javelin, so it propels through the air rather than just moving horizontally. So with the correct technique, so this would make them, without the concentration, it would make them more likely to make the mistakes. So as we mentioned, misjudging the foul line, and that affects the distance they're able to jump and their takeoff point. So this would impact their form, so it wouldn't be as good of a position, which limits their height and distance. So other factors include temporary loss of strength and energy. So for sports like weightlifting, the athlete's muscles are being put under severe stress due to the increasing resistance each time that they have to lift above the head. And therefore, depending on the athlete's skill level and their physical capability, it will be reduced. So therefore, they will be forced to stop and not be able to lift the weight above their head, and therefore sacrifice themselves in the competition. So this is due to the fatigue causing a decline in the speed and strength, because the muscles are not able to take on the weight of the resistance. So also, fatigue is context specific. This is the idea that depending on the different environment, it can affect the athlete in different ways. These are a result in the reduction of force the athlete is able to produce, and this then leads to an inability to create enough force to maintain the exercise. So the athlete rather has to stop or performs badly. And so therefore this then impacts them in their performance. And we're going to look at the different strategies that we can use and athletes can use in order to delay fatigue or even prevent it for a longer period of time. So there are three main types of fatigue. These are local, general and chronic. So first of all, we're going to look at local. So local fatigue is localised in the muscles and as a result of the impulses not being sent sufficiently by the motor neurons to the muscles. This means that the muscles contract irregularly and insufficiently. So this then makes the athlete have a reduced ability to move the muscle group and could result in them from sustaining an injury. And this mainly occurs in sports that have repeated muscle contractions. So anything from running to weightlifting, where the athlete is constantly being put under strenuous exercise. Next, we have chronic fatigue, which is a result of the athlete having a weakened immune system from an injury which has caused an infection or a disease. This type of fatigue is more serious than the others, as it can have much longer consequences on the individual, which might affect their participation in their sport for a prolonged period of time, and therefore this will decrease their fitness level. So it may make it harder for them to get back into their training program and be able to meet the expectation they were meeting before. And this is where it can have the psychological effect on their psychological fatigue, because they're feeling unmotivated in order to get back to the progress that they were at before. And lastly, we have general fatigue or psychological fatigue, which we have previously mentioned. So this is the feeling of psychological or physiologically being affected after exercise, and the idea of not being able to be motivated in order to participate in training programs because of the stress that they've been put under through their sport. So this is basically the concept of where an athlete is overtraining by making their training increasingly hard to improve their muscles in order to help them resist fatigue and improve their general cardiovascular system in terms of its efficiency to deliver oxygen to the working organs and respiring tissues. This type of fatigue greatly affects the individual's concentration, so their ability to pay attention and react to situations and instructions will be affected both in and out of the sport. In high maximal activity, this requires the muscles to be contracting at their maximum to generate the force for the short duration. But if the athlete does not allow time for recovery after this, then their muscles will cramp and feel fatigued for a longer period of time, as not enough time is being given for the athlete in order to hydrolyse the lactate and remove it from the body. So this causes a greater risk of injury because the hydrogen ions are being left in the muscles, and therefore this is going to then affect their physiological health, because they're going to obviously be hurting and it's going to be sore after exercise. So athletes take part in exercise, and their training program helps their long-term adaptations. So particularly the muscle fibres are able to function for a longer period of time to delay fatigue, which we will come to later. It can also occur in submaximal activity, where the athlete is working continuously, like long distance running, where the athlete's muscles are contracting less vigorously but continuously. So the stress on the muscles is being prolonged over a period of time rather than in just a short duration. So it's still having the same effect. These athletes will experience depleted energy stores and therefore find it more difficult to sustain the intensity and continue. But that said, they could probably continue physically, but their psychological thoughts tell them that they can't, and therefore they reduce their performance or even stop because they feel like they can't continue, when probably their fitness level means they could. So here's an example of a triathlon. So if we consider what we've talked about fatigue in a triathlon, we understand that triathlon is a low intensity but a high duration event where the athletes are working continuously for a long period of time. So in the triathlon we have the running phase, the swimming phase, and the cycling phase, which are all long distance and require the athlete to sustain their performance over a longer period of time. Therefore, they are using the aerobic system. So this means they have oxygen that they're using in order to create ATP. The athletes need this continuous supply of oxygen in order to enable them to continue for the duration of the event. And because the event is so enduring, it requires their endurance to be at their maximum so they can undertake all 3 tasks in the event. And the strenuous exercise is mainly affecting their muscles of the legs, the muscle groups of the hamstrings and the quadriceps and the tibialis anterior, because the constant demands that they need in order to have oxygen to produce the ATP. So therefore, leading up to their event, the athlete's training program will consist of exercises and strategies in order to help resist fatigue so they can delay their anaerobic threshold. So this is the threshold in where oxygen is limited and they actually have to respire without oxygen. So then they will have to reduce their performance because they will no longer be able to sustain that intensity. So they have different strategies that they use in order to help delay this fatigue on their muscles. Because in the transition to the different phases of the event, the athlete may have to increase their intensity in order to beat an opponent to get a better start in the next event. And therefore this can produce lactic acid and waste products that need to be expelled out of the body, because otherwise this can help to induce fatigue. So these long-term adaptations help to, like we said, delay the anaerobic threshold and sort of delay the lactate accumulation, so it won't prevent them from their performance deteriorating and therefore potentially not being able to finish the race or not placing in the top 5. It would also help to reduce fatigue, particularly of the muscles that are undergoing the strenuous exercise. So the muscles of the legs particularly will be producing lactic acid if they're in the transition phases, because they are working without oxygen. So by then the athlete balancing the demands and working at steady state where the oxygen consumption is meeting the demands, then therefore the lactic acid is then being removed and the oxygen can be used in order to power the athlete through the race, because they are working at a continuous intensity.